So thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here, speaking in this amazing place, to be in Split, and to have been able also to hear many other people speaking this morning, to enter a bit more into the life of the church and of the politically involved people in Croatia. So I'm going to give a talk under the title, Facing Today's Crisis, Drawing on Catholic Social Thought and Christian Democracy. This is partly because I did something similar in London not that long ago. So I thought it would be interesting to try a similar talk. I've changed it a little bit, but in the light of what Bruno said to me about it, to make it a bit better for this audience. But I'm interested to see how you react to it. I think some of the things you might say, you might find a little bit simplistic, but it's a function of the audience it was originally written for, this talk. Anyhow, let's see how we go. So I'd like to begin with, I'm sorry about having my back to you. I'd like to begin with a phrase from Benedict XVI's talk when he went to UK in 2010, and he spoke in Westminster Hall. Westminster Hall is a very, very evocative place for British people. You know, it's the heart of the history of democracy in the country. It's where Thomas More was condemned. It's got a lot of meaning, this place. So he gave a talk to the combined Houses of Parliament in 2010. So the phrase I'd like to take out of it is this one. Religion, he said, is not a problem for legislators to solve, but a vital contributor to the national conversation. Religion is not a problem for legislators to solve, but a vital contributor to the national conversation. Now, he'd just spoken about the need for solid ethical principles to undergird the work of government. Principles discoverable through natural means, scientific, historical, through participatory dialogue, so different ways of discovering these natural principles. And of how faith then could purify, this is the verb he used, faith could purify and shed light on these principles, while also reason could purify, same verb used, reason could purify and structure faith. So there's this two-way relation between reason and faith, such that, he says, the world of reason and the world of faith need one another. So here I want to use that phrase and the context in which it was said to set the tone for this discussion. That is, that religion, and specifically in this case Christianity, can make a vital contribution to the national conversation around the other part of our title, Facing Our Crisis, the crisis that we're in. Which of course raises the question, what is the crisis? What is this crisis? It seems to range from very concrete practical issues, like the cost of living crisis or the Ukrainian crisis, to fundamental philosophical or intellectual issues, such as the identity crisis, and then through that to the existential threat of the ecological crisis. And I'm sure we could add other dimensions to this crisis, just some of them. In fact, we seem to see the word crisis around us all the time now. We could say that we are in, and this is a quote from a book, a great crisis of values, perceived by some as a global crisis of Western civilization and connected to a growing de-Christianization. Except that that phrase, as it was written, does not refer to our period in history. It was written about the 1920s and 30s, so 100 years ago now, where the crisis of values had already led to the rise of Soviet communism and Italian fascism, and was preparing the way for German Nazism, all against the backdrop of the great crash on Wall Street and the sense that democracy and modern liberal thought as a whole would not survive. I carry on quoting from the same book. It's written by a Spanish writer, Burgos. Catholics in particular, he says, conceived this crisis, so the crisis 100 years ago, as a change of epoch. Very interesting, because Pope Francis uses the same term today, as many of you know. So Catholics in particular conceived this crisis as a change of epoch in which a civilization that for 2,000 years had been based on Christianity, fed by its sap, and inspired more or less explicitly by its ethics and dogmas, had decided to expressly cease being Christian and to follow other paths which seemed to lead to a precipice. So, this crisis they face seems much more dramatic in that sense than the one we are facing. So it may be interesting to look at how Catholic social thought and Christian democracy were reacting to this period of crisis to help us in facing our crisis. So we'll do this first, and then we'll look at our situation. So official Catholic social teaching at that time was mostly focused on the idea of corporatism or corporativism, a medieval social form which had been abolished by the French Revolution because it was seen as against individual freedom, but which had continuously circulated among Catholic thinkers and leaders since that time as a possible alternative to modern liberal politics and economics. In 1884, at Fribourg, a group of leading Catholic thinkers had defined corporatism in this way, and I quote, "A system of social organization that has at its base the grouping of people according to the community of their natural interests and their social functions. And," so that's the first part, "grouped by their natural interests and social functions." And then the second part, "and as a true and just organs of the state, direct and coordinate work and capital in matters of common interest." So we can see it's quite different from liberal thinking, or liberal democracy or liberal capitalism. In the 1899 social program of Christian democracy, written by Giuseppe Toniolo, so a little bit later than the Fribourg statement, Toniolo, who's now a blessed, by the way, in the first of the 12 points of this program, he calls for the gradual organization of society in professional cooperative associations. Now, these are just two examples. We could find lots of examples from this pre-1920 period where Catholics are proposing some form of corporatism or corporativism. So by the time we get to the early 1930s, and in the face of the crisis we have been talking about, it is really no surprise that Pius XI makes corporatism a core feature of his key document at that time, the 1931 encyclical Quadragesimo Anno. It just seemed like a realistic way forward in the face of the crisis that Western liberalism was facing, brought about by the 1929 crash, and also in order to prevent communism spreading across the whole of Europe. As we know, in practice, the actual applications of corporatism, at least at that time, were not very successful. Though we should say that this was at least in part because almost all these attempts were in countries with historically weak political institutions, and at that time, totalitarian governments. So two classic examples would be Italy and Portugal from this period. And indeed, we should say that Pius XI, in his Quadragesimo Anno, makes a thinly veiled criticism of fascist corporatism alongside as presenting corporatism which he sees based on Catholic social teaching. Nevertheless, in the end, corporatism in Catholic social thought gets inevitably tarred by its association with fascism, even if the Pope had tried to separate a CST-inspired corporatism from a fascist-controlled one. Interestingly, in a book which was important for the presentation I made in London by Michael Fogarty, it was published in the 1950s with the title Christian Democracy in Western Europe, 1820 to 1953, and it's still one of the most important books published in Britain about Christian democracy. So it's interesting, in that book, in the 1950s, Fogarty doesn't even mention corporatism at all. It's just ignored. And I think it's very hard to imagine that he didn't actually know what the importance of corporatism had been in Christian democratic circles for the first 100 years of his book, 1820 to 1920. The whole idea of corporatism had just become too discredited, and he tried to leave it out of the story. Now, one should say, just to finish this part about corporatism, in contrast to the way Catholics felt about corporatism after the Second World War, a discredited idea, it is worth noting that subsequently, corporatism has been taken quite seriously by a number of social analysts, especially in the Nordic countries. And it's still discussed among some scholars. For instance, as recently as 2019, there was a book that came out, published by Routledge, with the title Corporatism in Africa, Comparative Analysis and Practice, which argued that it was quite strange that no study had yet been done on this phenomenon in Africa. Many of the same kinds of thinkers argue that in various forms of what is called neo-corporatism, corporatism is still with us. But nevertheless, despite these other uses of the idea, I don't think it represents such a helpful source for us in the face of our current situation as the second type of reaction to the crisis of the 1920s and 30s that the Catholics had. For at the same time, there was another group of Catholic thinkers, almost all of them lay people, at least at the beginning, and almost all very devout Catholics, who were very influential over the subsequent development of Christian democracy, and who developed another response to the crisis. The idea or the movement or the approach, there are various words for it, called personalism, and it's already been mentioned a bit in this meeting. Because they focused on the question, who is man, or who is the human being, rather than on the question of structural order, as we had in corporatism. And they were reacting against the individualism of modern liberal thought and the collectivism of totalitarian systems like communism and fascism, which we could see as sort of two sides of the same coin. If you want to put individuals together, you have to have some kind of collectivism. Now, unlike corporatism, personalism in Michael Fogarty's 1950 book is given a very high place. It's part of the title of the first main chapter of the book on the thought that inspired Christian democracy. So he gives the chapter the title, Personalist, Not Individualist. And so it's about the current relevance to our crisis of the idea of personalism that I would like to devote most of the rest of this talk. So first of all, I want to say three things about personalism in the past, in the 20th century, before looking at its relevance for us today. So the first thing to say about it, I think, is, and this is perhaps partly because it was a lay-led movement, the personalist movement, without much guidance or direction, or we might say interference, if we want to use that word, from the hierarchy, that we find, especially in its early phase, that there are many forms of personalism. There's a whole range of them. Some of them are nearer to existentialism. So Gabriel Marcel would be one of the main exponents of the existentialist form. Some are nearer to phenomenology, and we would see a bit later Karol Wojtyła, of course, the subsequent John Paul II, as one of the exponents of the phenomenological personalism. And then some are nearer to Thomism, and in this group, Jacques Maritain would be the leading figure. The most well-known thinker in the movement as a whole, Emmanuel Mounier, was somewhere between existentialism and Thomism. because he'd been formed in the Grande École in Paris, so he was very influenced by existentialism there, but he also owed a lot to Maritain, so he was close to Maritain as well. But the interesting thing about Mounier is he resisted until the very end of his life the idea of developing anything like a personalistic philosophy as such. He wanted something like a perspective, as he called it in his 1947 book, What is Personalism? And here's a quote translated into English. Personalism is not a system, he says. It's not a political machine. It's a perspective on human problems. And then he carries on. The best thing would be that having reawakened in sufficient people the complete meaning of the human person, it would disappear without trace so as to merge with the allure of our days. You know, it's very kind of dramatic, evocative language, okay, that he's using. Now, the resistance on the part of Mounier towards any kind of systematization of personalism was compounded, and this is my second of the 3 points, was compounded by what was going on within Thomism at the time. Because in the Thomistic synthesis, Catholicism had a very strong philosophical starting point within which to develop a personalist approach. Indeed, I think it is the Thomistic version of personalism that is the most useful form for us today, so we'll come back to it later. But in the 1920s, Thomism was seen as the official theological and philosophical system of the Catholic Church. And thanks in part to the modernist crisis that had been raging less than 20 years before, even though this had been more a crisis about biblical scholarship than about social questions, nevertheless, many Thomists saw their job to be that of defending Thomism against modern thinking. Nowadays, we would see the kind of Thomism they were trying to defend as what we would call neo-Thomist, a kind of Thomism that had been influenced by its struggles with the very Enlightenment they were trying to resist, and which in the process had adopted some Enlightenment ways of thinking that were alien to St. Thomas himself, and which we've been able to uncover over the last 70 or 80 years as part of the recensement of Thomistic thinking that's taken place now. So in the difficult context of the 1920s and 30s, Maritain was continuously attacked by other Thomists in his work in developing a Thomistic personalism. So this all means that the impact that personalism could have, or could have had more widely, was limited because of this infighting over its development between Thomistic experts. So all this leads to my third and final point about Thomism in the 20th century. And I think this point is more applicable to the UK context than here, but it'll be interesting to hear what my Croatian audience thinks about this. If personalism was so important in the 1920s and 30s for the church, and so good, why has almost no one ever heard of it? This is certainly true in UK, maybe less true here. Well, I think one of the key reasons for the non-success of personalism must be the premature death in 1950 at the tender age of 45 of Emmanuel Mounier, its leading exponent, just at the moment when he was beginning to think that maybe personalism should be developed as a philosophical system in its own right, even though he'd been resisting this idea up to then. Now, for this, and probably for other reasons, as Paul Ricoeur has argued in two important texts about personalism, it did not develop into a fully fledged philosophical approach, so it could not compete with the two main alternatives on offer at that time, the Marxist approach and the existentialist approach, or Marxist philosophy and existentialist philosophy. So to quote Burgos again, he says, Ricoeur's thesis is that in the confrontation with those two formidable philosophies, personalism easily succumbed, because it did not deploy the conceptual instruments for maintaining a substantial fight in the intellectual confrontation between a movement or inspiration or perspective, as we'd said before, and two fully fledged philosophies. The result was foreseeable. So overall then, personalism didn't succeed in affirming itself, except within the movement of Christian democracy, where it was really quite important, as Fogarty's book shows very well. This book about Christian democracy in Western Europe. Now, I think the fact that Christian democracy had this philosophical thinking, but didn't really have a proper philosophical framework to work within, this may be one of the key reasons why Christian democracy hasn't been so often misunderstood by political scientists and others. And I'm not going to say any more about this, but if somebody's interested, I think the writings of a Dutch scholar, Van Kersbergen, are very, very interesting on this point, on why Christian democracy has been so often misunderstood in political science. Furthermore, Christian Democrats, unlike Marxist politicians, did not have access to economic, political, and social theories that started from a personalistic understanding of the human being, meaning that its basic philosophical orientation had difficulty going beyond that, going into a more practical phase, into the economy, into the political science sphere, into sociology. So they had difficulty creating practical policy that was clearly connected with this philosophical starting point. So I think this, among other factors, made them weaker than they should have been and more susceptible to decline, especially in the face of the neoliberal onslaught that Western Europe experienced from the 1980s onwards, and then was also experienced in Central Europe after the collapse of communism. So, given this complicated history, why turn to personalism now? Why should personalism be useful to us in the face of our crisis, given this complicated history? Well, I think it's because the problems that we are facing today that are at the root of our crisis are largely social and systemic. But our basic mindset, provided by the philosophers of the Enlightenment in the 17th and primarily 18th centuries, starts from an inadequate point of view, from an individualistic point of view of the human person. And this makes it much harder for us to deal with problems that are basically social, such as social exclusion, or that require coordinated systemic action, like dealing with the environmental degradation we're facing. So dealing with this problem in a way that does not do violence to human freedom. Okay? So personalism has potential to help us with that. So I'd like to dedicate the rest of the talk looking at how that potential might be developed. So first of all, I want to say something about this Thomistic personalism, which I think is the most useful form for us today. And I'm going to refer primarily to Maritain himself and his 1947 book, The Person and the Common Good. So to give an outline of some of the basic ideas. So the idea of person, Maritain says, is developed in early Christian theology, as we know, to explain how God could be both one and three at the same time. You know, we have to deal with the principle of non-contradiction. It can't be one and three at the same time. So we get to this idea of one substance, three persons. In God, then, the three persons are pure relation, since God is one, as we know from the Old Testament. We also know from the Old Testament, from the book of Genesis, that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. So it should be possible to apply the idea of the person, by analogy, to the human being too. But no one had actually tried to do this in any systematic way until the personalists started trying to do it in the last century. So Maritain starts by saying that the human being consists of two poles, he says, a material or individual pole and a spiritual or personal pole, and that we live in the tension between these two poles, even if the two poles constitute one substance, one being. Now, in fact, we're used to recognizing two dimensions to the human being. We talk about body and soul. We talk about matter and spirit. We have different ways of recognizing these two dimensions, one material, one non-material. So thus far, there's nothing especially new in this thinking. We also have other theories that have a kind of dual nature, like the wave-particle theory of light. You know, there are some experiments that we can only explain if we think of light as a particle, and then there's other ones which we can only explain if we think of light as a wave. We can't get to a more simple explanation of light. We have to have these two ideas existing in a kind of tension between them. Maritain uses his example in the 1947 book of a work of art, which he says on one level is a set of chemicals layered one on top of the other. But when we look at the Sistine Chapel or at the Mona Lisa or some other great work of art, we see something that raises our spirit. In a sense, then, the work of art also has two dimensions to it. And just as the work of art is entirely a structured order of chemical layers, as well as a profound image with deep meaning, so the human being is both entirely an individual and entirely a person at the same time. So let's talk about these two poles, these two dimensions. It is our material dimension, our bodies, that individuate us, fix us in space and time. So insofar as we are individuals, we are needy because we are material. We have survival needs: food, clothing, shelter, healthcare. And to satisfy these needs, we can sometimes be in competition with others. So we can see how an individualistic mindset could work when we think about this aspect of our being, and why economic theories and other theories based on individual preferences and competition between us can work up to a point. They are partially right, because in a real sense, we are individuals. Since we are individuated by our bodies, we are all individuals of this particular species we belong to, which we can name Homo sapiens sapiens. And the same rule applies to us that applies to all members of animal species. The good of the group, in our case, the common good, takes precedence over the good of the individual. And we know this in practice. For instance, as employees, we can get paid if the business we work for can produce the money it should produce, make its profit, cover its costs, and then share the resources with all those who've been part of that. Our good, each one of us as individuals, as employees, depends on the good of the group. And if we don't try to make that good work, we are going to lose out. So insofar as we are individuals and part of a group, the common good goes before our individual good. Now, the innovative part of personalist philosophy regards the way it thinks about the spiritual or non-material dimension of the human being. That dimension called the person. Because the crucial innovation here is that Maritain argues that our soul or our spiritual dimension is what he calls intrinsically relational, because it is personal, by analogy with the persons of the Trinity. Whereas as individuals we relate to others so as to achieve our individual survival goals, so our relationships with others are useful or instrumental to achieving those individual goals, as persons we relate to others because we find ourselves in doing that. In other words, our relationships are intrinsic to who we are. We do not relate because we are needy and need others to help us get what we need, but because we are overflowing with abundance, desiring to give, to share, to love. We relate to others as persons from a position of strength, of abundance, not weakness. And you can see here the tension between these two poles. Now we can see here why the happiness research, which is done in all the countries of the world now, why the happiness research gives us the results that it does. Across the world, independently of culture, the number one factor that correlates most with the happiness of human beings is the quality of their relationships around them. That's the same the world over. Now, it's true that people who are very poor experience the pain of not having enough of the basics, and that reduces their happiness. But beyond a very modest level of economic wealth, the key factor which makes people feel happy is their relationships. And sometimes if they have more economic wealth and this damages the relationships, they can have lower levels of happiness. Okay, so that's first stage of this argument. Next bit is, as persons, we are not part of any animal species. In a real sense, we can say we are each our own species. We are known in a unique way by God. We are each loved personally by God. In a way not dissimilar to angels. As you may know, St. Thomas teaches that each angel is his own species. Okay. Furthermore, as persons, as spiritual beings, we have a destiny that goes beyond this world. And therefore, in the sense that we are persons, our good is not subject to the earthly common good, but rather that common good supports each one of us. So you can see we're setting up what looks like a contradiction here. Looks like, at least we can see why we said at the beginning there's a tension in these poles. So this last point about the relationship between us as persons and the earthly common good leads us to a brief discussion of the relation between human beings and the common good. A crucial issue if personalism is going to help us resolve our social and systemic problems. Firstly, we should say the common good in itself should be placed between two extremes. Either the totalitarian good of the whole, and Maritain talks about the good of the beehive, that the bees are absorbed into the whole. They don't have a good outside the shared good. Or, the other extreme, the sum of nothing more than individual goods. So Maritain says the common good of a society of persons is common to the whole and to the parts. This is important. So we can say human society is at the same time a whole made up of parts and a whole made up of wholes. So it's no surprising that as there are two poles in the human being, so we could see two poles in the common good as well. Our society is in between the pure divine society of the Trinity and what he calls the improperly called society of animals. Because animals are really just individuals of a species. And when they are together, they are more like a collective, a collection of individuals, than a society like ours. So, the crucial language he uses to describe our relationship, each one of us, to the common good, is to say the relationship is one of reciprocal subordination, and mutual implication. Reciprocal subordination and mutual implication. Insofar as we are individuals, as we just said, we are subordinated to society. Insofar as we are persons with an eternal destiny, temporal society is ordered to the good of each one of us. Now, the most dramatic example of the recognition of these two aspects of our relation to the common good, reciprocal subordination and mutual implication, is the situation of war. We can see this played out most clearly in the war situation. In such situations, the state can ask and even obligate people to expose themselves to the risk of death in combat. But when a mission requires the almost certain death of those who carry it out, what in English we call a suicide mission, it's well-established practice in the military to ask for volunteers, so that those who participate in such missions are not constrained to die, but freely and voluntarily offer their lives for the sake of their community. As Maritain says, the state authority cannot decree the death of a man for the salvation of the city. The person can be obligated in conscience and, if necessary, constrained to expose its life, but can never be branded like an animal for the slaughterhouse. It is still as master of itself and by an act of virtue that it faces death. Now, another way of saying this, which Maritain uses, is to say that we are each a part of society, but not, as he says, by means of all that is in us. And he uses the example of the athlete. In running a race, an athlete is completely involved. He or she couldn't be doing something else while in the race. But that race does not involve the person as a whole, doesn't involve their knowledge of French or their skill as a teacher or many, many other capacities that they have. He also gives the example of a mathematician. The state, representing the common good, could require him or her to teach mathematics, and perhaps to teach in a certain number of hours, or to teach a certain timetable, or in a certain school. However, since the principles of mathematics do not depend on the community, but come from the understanding of the human intellect, which forms part of the higher supratemporal order of the accomplishment of the person as person, the state cannot require the mathematician to hold or teach a mathematics that we could say is politically correct, something like an Aryan mathematics or a Marxist-Leninist mathematics or something like this. In other words, it cannot require the teacher to hold as true something that he or she regards as false or mistaken. And we might today think about some of the arguments we had this morning about sexual identity and the possibility that teachers of biology might be pressured to change their teaching to make it more amenable to certain theories that we have today of gender. While we might well want to inform children that there are people who do take this position seriously, we should also be able to show them how we think this position is mistaken, because if we truly are convinced about this on the basis of scientific evidence. So our knowledge is part of our rational, spiritual nature, and that goes beyond the temporal common good. We have to be left free to teach what we think is true, even if we need to have the humility to recognize that we might be mistaken and that we always need to be open to learn. And I might say here, as a woman, I wouldn't be here with you as a dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences or the president of the Academy of Social Sciences in the Vatican, or maybe even giving this talk at all, if we hadn't had the humility to learn something different from what we thought was the norm 100 years ago. So this learning is important, but still we have to be able to teach what we think is true. So that's a sort of trying to explain to you the relation between individual and person in Maritain's thinking about personalism. So how could this personalism help us with our problems today? Well, I think Maritain gives proper recognition to our individual dimension, which makes sense to mainstream thinking today. At the same time, he expands our vision to a richer, more complete picture of the human person. Using such a model would require economists and political scientists to expand their limited, or we might say reductionist, view of the human being, but not to abandon everything they have done so far. Rather, they are called to build on what they have done and what they know, develop it, go further, take it beyond the limits it's suffering from at the moment, and therefore also in many ways fundamentally change it. Once economists, political scientists and sociologists have found a way to develop economic, social and political theories that can imagine and model intrinsically valuable
not just useful relationships, can model the human being with these two poles, so that the relationships between actors in the economy and society as a whole can include this intrinsic side, we will be able to have the tools to understand and develop the common good, which is a shared good between the members of our community, in a more clear and complete way. We will be able to confront the problems of exclusion better because we will be modeling relationships in a more profound way. We will be able to confront the systemic problems of environmental decay better because we will be able to imagine communities and the systems they build between them better. Now, what we are talking about here is a kind of revision of the fundamentals of the social philosophy that became established as the norm in the West in the middle of the 18th century, and which has provided the basic framework for our modern system up to our day. Now, that system was devised to deal with the social and political and economic problems that society faced around 1750. But the problems we face are different. And this synthesis no longer has enough functionality, enough capability to help us deal with our problems, which are primarily, as I say, social and systemic, because they are built on an individualistic idea of the human being. Maybe, I don't want to make any judgment about it at the time, maybe it made sense at that time to develop an individualistic view, given the kinds of problems society was facing at that time. But now it doesn't make sense for us anymore to continue this way of thinking. With the help of relationally rethought economic, social and political theories, we can imagine and model a new world in which we have the potential, I think, at least the intellectual and conceptual resources to resolve the current problems underlying our current crisis. Now, I should come to the end now because I've been talking a lot. You can see that it's very theoretical, my talk, and I'm sorry about that. It's partly because I think the application of personalism that I'm talking about here hasn't really been taken very far practically. The Christian democratic movement tried to do it, but they were blocked by some of the gaps in the thinking that we had then. In a group that I'm part of called Blueprint for Better Business, based in the UK, which was founded as a result of Caritas in Veritate, and the business leaders based around in the city, primarily, the City of London, who wanted to understand more about what this encyclical could give them, we tried to work out some of these ideas, but we're really just at the beginning of doing it. And I think also the Economy of Francesco and maybe some other movements that you know here are also trying to do this. I think that in the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, we should be working on this. And I hope that over the next 3 years, in a project we have, which is called the Fraternal Economy of Integral and Sustainable Development, we should start producing some of the thinking that's needed. And I just give you some, I didn't devise this project, but I was coming into the Academy when it was being developed. I just give you some of the wording of the concept paper behind the project. It says, an important element of this new series of workshops, which is how the project's going to work, will be an investigation of the metaphysical and anthropological vision underlying the Economy of Francesco, articulated by Pope Francis and other leading thinkers. The ethical themes of fraternity, relationality, subsidiarity, and dignity of the person will be cross-cutting features of each meeting, as will be the intrinsic relationship between economics and ecology. So that there's some more text, then I would skip to the next paragraph. First, it says, the new economy of sustainable and integral development should promote the happiness, brackets, beatudo, very important word in the history of Christian theology, so happiness understood as beatudo, of current and future generations, and respect the planetary boundaries of Earth's physical systems. Second, so firstly it should do that. Secondly, the new economy should promote the fulfillment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Nobody knows anything about the economic rights which are at the end of the Declaration, which nobody ever talks about these. So we want the more complete application of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Sustainable Development Goals, both of which have been agreed upon in the international fora. So there's other things we could say about that, but just to give you a sense about what this project is trying to do. What is sure is that we will need people with many different competencies working together on these kinds of projects. Academics in many disciplines and people with many different kinds of practical and technical skills and experience to help us make the breakthrough that we need. So, to conclude, I would say maybe it's only now that the real importance of the Christian democratic tradition that emerged in the 20th century, maybe it's only now that its real importance can emerge, because thanks to the work we can do now, it could begin, or politicians could begin, to have personalist rather than individualist social and economic theories at their disposal to help them come up with the policies and legislation that can put into practice the basic personalist idea that Christian democracy tried to champion in the 20th century. Perhaps future historians looking back at this time will be able to say that the Christian democratic movement in the 20th century, which many commentators today think is dead and gone, was actually a kind of pilot project for a much bigger and more profound phase of a similar personalist movement that you and I can help launch in the 21st century. Let's hope and pray and work that it may be so. Thank you very much.